And this
They had, where is that?
that's the bottom of page 8.
Yes, but you have to understand what is meant by a serious adverse event. They try to accumulate all things that happen to children in a trial. And when they say it's serious, they mean it's not something like pain in the arm or something that's relatively trivial. And then they evaluate whether or not the serious adverse event could be related to the vaccine or not. And what this says is that only one of those events was attributed to the vaccine.
That's right. That's exactly what this says. What I'm
Yes.
asking, and you told me that the people that evaluate that is a board set up by the company, the pharmaceutical company seeking approval, correct?
Yes, they
Okay.
set up the board and they choose individuals who are not employees of the company.
But they choose the individuals, correct?
They choose the individuals, yes.
In your experience, Dr. Plotkin, in any given 30-day period, do 3.4% of children in this country experience a serious adverse event?
Yes, that's quite possible.
Okay. In your experience, would you expect 3.4% of children receiving a saline injection to experience a serious adverse event within 30 days of receiving the injection?
That's what that means, yes.
Okay, so 3.4% every month, that would mean within 3 years, every child in this country would experience a serious adverse event, correct?
Yes,
That's
correct.
right.
But
Okay.
you have to understand that serious adverse events mean, for example, that a child develops a respiratory infection during the period of the trial. And then the question is, could that respiratory infection be attributed to the vaccine?
Mm-hmm.
And the board decides whether or not it's likely that a vaccine could cause a respiratory infection 2 or 3 weeks after the vaccination, for example.
Wasn't there recently a study out of Hong Kong in which it was actually one of the few randomized placebo-controlled studies in which some children were randomly got flu vaccine and others didn't get the flu shot, and those that got the flu shot and those who didn't had the same rate of flu, but those who got the flu shot were 4 times more likely to get certain other respiratory infections?
Well, I have not read that particular study.
We can get to it later.
But influenza vaccine is a whole story in itself.
Okay, that's fine. If you haven't read it, that's we can get to it. I have it. We'll come back to it. Now there's another Hib vaccine called Hibarex, right? And then which was licensed after Act Hib, correct?
Yes.
And in that clinical trial, they used Act Hib as the placebo to assess safety, correct?
If you say so.
Okay. All right. The CDC's pediatric schedule you testified earlier also includes vaccination for HPV, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna. Okay. I'm gonna hand you what's been marked as plaintiff's exhibit 15. Sorry, handing it to you. This is the manufacturer insert for Gardasil, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a vaccine against HPV.
Yes.
Gardasil is currently the only HPV vaccine used in the United States. I'm sorry. Gardasil, I'm going to ask you a question unrelated to what I just handed you for a moment while My co-counsel here sends a copy to opposing counsel.
You can keep on. I've seen the Gardasil insert.
Okay, thank you. So Gardasil is currently the only HPV used in the United States, correct?
I'm not sure whether the GSK vaccine is still being used or not, but Gardasil is the one that is used mostly in any case.
Okay. Can you please turn to page 8, table 9 of this insert? Okay. This table reflects girls and women 9 through 29 years of age who reported an incident condition potentially indicative of a systemic autoimmune disorder during the clinical trial, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The subjects receiving Gardasil show a rate of 2.3%. Right, so that means 2.3% of the girls and women in the clinical trial during a 6-month period had an incident that indicated a systemic autoimmune disorder, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in the AAHS control or saline placebo group, it shows the same rate, correct?
Yes.
Do you know how many individuals were in the saline placebo group versus the AAHS control group?
Well, it says 9,412.
All right, that would be the total number for both groups, correct?
No, for the placebo group.
For the placebo group, correct. But some of them received AAHS and some of them received the saline injection, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know how many received a saline injection over an AAHS injection?
Don't know.
Okay. Let's go to page 4. And table 1 is for girls and table 2 is for boys. I'm assuming all participants were either girls or boys. If we add up the saline placebo group for the girls and the saline placebo group for the boys, do we get 594?
Well, I'd have to do the arithmetic,
Okay.
but
It's
it
3.
appears that there were about 5,000, more than 5,000 in the AAHS control, and about 600 in the saline placebo.
Right. It's about 594. It's about 600. That's right. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if we go back to page 8, the saline placebo group had about 600, and the rest of them were AAH control, correct?
Apparently, yes.
Yeah. All right. What does AAHS stand for?
The aluminum adjuvant.
Okay. And I see it's defined here as amorphous aluminum
Hydroxyphosphate sulfate.
right?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Which we'll refer to as AAHS, or the aluminum adjuvant.
Yes.
Good? Okay. AAHS is not an inert substance, correct?
Well, it's not saline, if that's what you mean. But they use it as a control because they're trying to to determine what the reactions are to the HPV vaccine that contains the aluminum, and separating the reactions to vaccine from reactions to the aluminum.
Make sure I understand that. Are you saying they're trying to determine what the rate of reactions is between the group that gets Gardasil
Yes,
with the group that gets the aluminum
Yes.
with the group that gets saline?
yes,
So they want us to compare between those three distinct groups, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they did do that in table 1 and 2 that we just looked at on page 2.
Yes,
Page 4, correct?
yes.
Okay. Why is aluminum added to the Gardasil vaccine or any vaccine?
To increase the immunogenicity of the active part of the vaccine.
If I may, what you mean is that if I could use a little more layman terms, are you saying it's intended to stimulate the immune system to create antibodies?
Yes,
Would that be correct?
yes, not by itself, but by enhancing the response to the vaccine antigens.
The antigens bind to the aluminum,
Yes,
and the aluminum is persistent
yes,
and it remains in the body such that it continues to present the antigen such that antibodies can be created to it, correct?
well, at least during the immediate period of vaccination, yes.
Okay. There is, in fact, a syndrome called autoimmune autoinflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants, correct?
That is a debatable point. There was a fellow named Yehuda Schoenfeld, an Israeli, who has pushed this idea for many years. I think it's fair to say that he has never had acceptance by the larger community of immunologists or rheumatologists.
I am going to hand you what is being marked. Mm-hmm. I'm going to hand you what's being marked as Exhibit 16.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this book?
Generally speaking, yes. I can't say I've read it all, no.
Okay. And it's entitled Vaccines and Autoimmunity, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And it extensively discusses, it discusses many autoimmune conditions that the authors believe can be caused
Yes.
by vaccines, and in particular by aluminum adjuvant, correct?
Well, I don't know about it.
Aluminum adjuvant.
I don't know about particularly aluminum adjuvants, but that's one of their arguments.
Okay. Can you please turn to the contributors, which starts on little Roman numeral 9. Okay. Keep going. 2 more pages. Okay. There are, I think, somewhere around 77 contributors listed here. You said that Yehuda Schoenfeld was kind of alone, I think, or something like that, with regard to the claim that of autoinflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants.
Yes.
Can you just flip through and look at the universities that are listed here, where these over 70 professors hail from? Are these respected institutions of medicine around the world?
Well, first of all, Counselor, I'd have to go over the CVs of each of the people here. I don't know what their role is at the universities. As I said before, Schoenfeld, first of all, Schoenfeld himself is not anti-vaccination. I know that for a fact. On the other hand, at least one of his co-authors, Tom Tomljanovich, is a well-known anti-vaccination person who's written a lot about how terrible vaccines are. And as far as the articles are concerned, I have to read each one. But for example, vaccination in patients with autoimmune inflammatory rheumatic diseases, in other words, patients who themselves already have autoimmune diseases, that's certainly a legitimate field of study. In other words, how do you vaccinate people who already have autoimmune disease? Could their vaccinations make things worse? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the vaccines themselves cause disease. Now, here we have a chapter called Measles, Mumps, and Rubella Vaccine, a triad to autoimmunity, of which Schoenfeld himself is one of the authors. I am, what shall I say, I do not believe there is any solid evidence that measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines cause autoimmune responses. So, lots of books are published, and a lot of them are absolute bull.
Are you saying that this book is bull?
I haven't read the whole thing, but I am almost certain that there's a lot of bull in it, judging from the editors.
Without reading it, right?
Without reading all of it, yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Tel Aviv Sourowski Medical Center?
No.
Okay. You're familiar with the University of Paris?
University of Paris. Paris has many different universities. They're sort of numbered.
Familiar with the University of Pisa?
No. Well, I'm sure there is a University of Pisa.
Okay. You familiar with the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology?
Yes.
The Rappaport School of Medicine?
Mm-hmm. I can tell you one thing, because I've talked to Israelis about Schoenfeld, and Schoenfeld's opinions are not majority opinions even in Israel.
But for better or worse, there is a syndrome out there that is called autoinflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants, and there are apparently professors at universities who disagree about the syndrome, but it is out there, right?
There is, Schoenfeld has postulated this syndrome, yes.
And there's at least 70 professors at universities around the world that are in agreement with that syndrome.
No, absolutely not. Okay. I'll bet if you go through that book and talk to them, you would find that most of them probably do not agree, because all of the articles in this book don't say that vaccines cause autoimmunity. Some of them do.
Okay. There has been concern raised that aluminum adjuvants in vaccines can cause autoimmunity.
There has been concerns raised, yes.
Okay. So if there's been concerns raised that aluminum in vaccines can cause autoimmunity, and there's this medical textbook, which I understand your opinion on, why combine the autoimmunity rate in the aluminum adjuvant control with the autoimmunity rate in the saline placebo? Why not break those out to show them separately?
Well, they did to some extent, but I think the reasoning was that they wanted to be sure that the reactions that were seen, and let me parenthetically say that HPV vaccine is painful. And they wanted to be sure that the reactions that they were seeing were not caused by the adjuvant, or that they were specific to the HPV antigens themselves and not to the adjuvant. So I judge that's why they did that.
Well, under that logic, then they certainly should have broken out the aluminum control from the saline placebo control and showed them in two separate columns on page 8, correct?
They probably should have, yes.
So that you could see the difference in autoimmune rate between the individuals receiving the aluminum and the saline placebo, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In your experience, would you expect 2.3% of the girls and women in this country between the ages of 9 and 26 to develop a systemic autoimmune condition in a 6-month period?
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer. I am not a rheumatologist, but when they say autoimmune conditions, I'd have to read exactly
There's a list.
what they mean.
If you go to page 8, they've got a long list right there of the conditions.
Yeah.
It starts with arthralgia.
Right. So. Yeah, so they have included just about everything that you could consider an autoimmune disorder, and all I can say is that they have, as I just said, they've attempted to include everything, and those are the data. What can I say?
Okay.
As far as 2.3% autoimmune disorders in 6 months. These are women 9 through 26 years of age, so they're not just girls. And I don't think it's impossible that that's the case, especially when you have a list of disorders that is so comprehensive as this.
Okay, so 2.3% in 6 months, 4.6% in a year. In 10 years, half the women in this country would have autoimmunity. Does that, in your experience, would that be accurate?
Well, again, I am not a rheumatologist, so I cannot answer that question specifically. All that I can say is that they attempted to do a comprehensive study of autoimmune phenomena or putative autoimmune phenomena in this study, and that's what they found.
What do you know the percentage of girls in the saline placebo group that developed a systemic autoimmune condition during this clinical trial versus the AAH control?
No,
AAHS?
No, I do not, without going back to the original study.
And Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's been marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 17. This is the clinical trial data for the saline placebo control group in the Gardasil trial. So you can go to page 2, Dr. Plotkin. You can see that the number of vaccinated in the placebo is 596. Right. Well, you can see at the top on the first page. I'm sorry. On the first page, Dr. Plotkin, it says a study of Gardasil in pre-adolescent adolescents. Correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm sorry.
A study of Gardasil in pre-adolescents and adolescents. Okay. And page 2, you can see that it has the 596 saline placebo recipients. Can you please turn to the serious adverse events section, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the seventh page. They don't print with page numbers, unfortunately.
Serious adverse events.
Okay, now if you go to the next page, run right after that, just take a look at that. You could see that the second column is the placebo, the results for the placebo group, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you please take a minute and go through each page and tell me if there was any value that wasn't 0 in terms of finding a serious adverse event?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. So in the saline placebo group during the trial, there was not a single systemic autoimmune disorder that was reported, but yet there was 218, 2.3% in, or maybe more actually, in the AAH control when you pull out the saline placebo group. Let me ask.
Again,
Go ahead,
you'd have
please.
to do the arithmetic, but if you subtract the 600 or so from the total, you could easily figure out the percentage in the aluminum group.
All right, so let's do that. Let's do that. So there's 900,412 in the aluminum group. Excuse me, in the total in both groups combined.
Yeah.
If we pull out the saline placebo group of 594 from the 9,412, would that make the 2.3% number go up or down?
It would go up slightly. That would be, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but that would be reducing the total to about 8,800. And so I guess that would be in here, right?
Go to page 8.
Right.
So the point is that if they would have broken out,
It would be 200 over 8,800. And I doubt if that would show a significant difference between the Gardasil and the AAHS group.
so the Gardasil group would show 2.3. It shows 2.3%.
Yes.
If we took out the saline placebo group from the second column, it would show 2.3 or above, around 2.3 still, correct?
Maybe
A little higher, 2.4, 2.5,
yeah.
2.5. And then if we had a third column that was just the saline placebo, it would show 0%.
Yeah.
Okay. Wouldn't that have been a significant finding to report?
And I don't think you'd have to ask a statistician, but I doubt that the statistical difference would be significant.
Doesn't it at least caution having a larger saline placebo group if your concern is statistics in terms of statistical power, which I
Yeah,
assume?
they might have done that.
But they didn't do
If
that.
yes, I don't know what that decision was based on, but if you're talking about implication of aluminum, there at this point there's really no reason to suspect that aluminum by itself can cause autoimmune disease.
Here is the pre-licensure clinical study in which 2.3% of participants in the Gardasil group and in the control group had a systemic autoimmune disorder, and it was deemed safe because they were around the same rate, right?
Yes.
But the saline placebo group that didn't get the aluminum adjuvant had a 0%. right?
A small group, yes.
Of 594.
Yeah.
And so the vaccine apparently, if you turn back, Dr. Plotkin, to page 4, please, of the Gardasil insert. You there?
Yeah.
Do you see that they break out Gardasil in one column, those who received AAHS control in another, and those that had saline placebo in a third column?
Right.
And that's with only 320 participants in the saline group in table 1, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and in table 2 they break it out as well, correct? The saline group from the AAHS control group?
Yes.
If you turn to page 5, they again break out the Gardasil, AAH control, and saline placebo groups in tables 3 and 4, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But they chose to conveniently combine it when it came to systemic autoimmune disorders, right?
Well, in the case of the page 4 and 5, they were looking at local reactions, and of course aluminum does give local reactions. On page 8, where they were looking at systemic autoimmunity, I guess they believed that aluminum in itself is a reasonable control and would not cause autoimmunity.
Okay, so going into this study, they just assumed aluminum wouldn't cause autoimmunity, and so that's how they proceed in designing it. I got it. All right. Let's... All right. Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's... yes, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 18. This is a, oh, did you send it? Okay. Okay. This is the manufacturer insert for a drug called Enbrel, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What is Enbrel a drug for?
Well, it's essentially an immunosuppressive, and it's I think it's used a lot for in autoimmune diseases and cancers.
This is a drug given to sick people, not healthy people, correct?
Right.
Unlike vaccines, which are typically given to healthy children and babies, right?
Right.
Okay. If you turn to page 10, Dr. Plotkin, go all the way to the bottom, the 6.1, section 6.1, clinical studies experience.
Mm-hmm.
The very first line under 6.1 says, the data described below reflect exposure to Enbrel in 2,219 adult patients with RA followed for up to 80 months.
Mm-hmm.
So in studying this drug given to 6 people, they reviewed safety for up to 6.5 years,
Mm-hmm.
correct? And they also used...
There's no answer to the question.
Oh.
As you're speaking.
Oh, sorry, say...
When you say correct, there's no
You're right.
answer.
I apologize. Okay.
Just
Was that a yes, Dr. Plotkin?
Yes.
Do we miss any others? No.
It's gradually happening more and more.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. And the placebo group here was, in this study, was a saline placebo for all controls, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So what is your point?
I think the point speaks for itself, Dr. Plotkin.
Well, it doesn't, because Enbrel is given over long periods of time, and one has to, since it's immunosuppressive, one has to look for things that may happen because of immunosuppression. Vaccines are given at particular times and are generally not continuously given over long periods of time. But because aside from that, you're basing this on the package circulars, not on the combined experience with the vaccines that in many cases has taken place over 50 or 60 years.
I'm basing this, Dr. Plotkin, I'm not basing anything on anything. I'm just asking you questions, and my questions are geared towards being able for my client to be able to pick up what is supposed to be a document that includes the clinical trial experience of the particular biologic or drug and understand what the adverse events rate was for that product. And that's all I'm trying to ask you questions about, to understand. That's it. And in terms of what you've just said about Enbrel, let's just we'll just talk about one quick vaccine, and we've really got to move on because it's got a little more material to cover. DTaP vaccines given at 2 months of age, correct?
Yes.
And at 4 months of age?
Yes.
And at 6 months of age?
Yes.
18 months?
Yes.
At 3 to 4 years of age?
Yes.
Then again at 11 years of age?
Yes.
In the slightly Tdap version?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here you have just one vaccine, put aside the other one, that is given over an extended period of time, but yet as we saw, as the manufacturer interest will show, there is no clinical trial that I'm aware of, and I'm happy for you to show me or produce one that actually does what the study in Enbrel does, which is has a saline placebo-controlled group and reviews safety over anything more than typically a few days or 30-day period.
I dispute that. I think it is almost certain, or certain in my mind, that they observed the patients over a longer period of time, but that they looked specifically for acute reactions during the first few days after immunization. And also, I add to that, and I insist on repeating, that one has to look at the total experience with a drug or a vaccine over a period of time, not simply what is in the FDA package circular.
So are you saying that instead of relying on clinical data, saline, inert placebo-controlled studies, we should just rely on the experience? Well, isn't it true that there's a lot of people out there? In fact, you've said used a lot of adjectives for them today so far, who are out there and say that their experience is that vaccines have caused all kinds of serious adverse reactions. Isn't that precisely what is on section 6.2 of each of those inserts? If your approach is used, why are they not given equal weight? I mean, if that's the way we're going to do science. I'm asking for the clinical data.
Science depends on a body of work. It does not depend on any single studies. It depends on repetition, on data that confirm other data. And so you cannot take any single study and rely on that and say that is the truth. The truth comes out of repetition and experience.
So is your point just to trust you versus actually have the actual data to support?
No, it's the accumulation of data.
And you can provide the data to support everything you're saying here today, correct?
Everything that I'm saying is in this book.
You wrote that book?
Sorry?
You're the editor of that book, correct?
Yes,
It's called Plotkin's Vaccines.
yes.
Dr. Plotkin, what is thrombocytopenia?
Decreased platelets.
Okay. Can it be caused by an autoimmune reaction? Isn't that what it's known to be caused by, the body attacking its own platelets?
That's one of the reasons, yes.
Okay. Can the MMR vaccine cause thrombocytopenia?
Yes.
Okay. What is brachial neuritis?
Brachial neuritis is basically a reaction to a local injection where you have pain in the arm.
I'm going to read you a definition of brachial neuritis from Johns Hopkins Medicine, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with it. Quote, brachial neuritis is a form of peripheral neuropathy that affects the chest, shoulder, arm, and hand. Peripheral neuropathy is a disease characterized by pain or loss of function in the nerves that carry signals to and from the brain and spinal cord, the central nervous system, to other parts of the body, end quote.
Yes.
Okay. Can DTaP or Tdap cause brachial neuritis?
If it's administered in the incorrect way, yes.
Okay. Can the MMR cause febrile seizures?
Yes.
Can the flu shot cause Guillain-Barré syndrome?
Uncertain, but possible.
Can the DTaP or Tdap cause Guillain-Barré syndrome?
Not that I'm aware of.
Hepatitis B cause Guillain-Barré syndrome?
Again, I don't think the evidence supports that. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a not uncommon event, particularly in adults.
After vaccination, is that what you mean?
No, I mean in general.
In general, okay. Can the hepatitis B vaccine cause encephalitis?
No, I would say definitely not.
Okay. Can the MMR vaccine cause acute or chronic arthritis?
It can cause, in adults, it can cause acute arthralgia, I would say, pains in the joints. But that does not seem to be a permanent phenomenon. And it's unusual in children.
So yes for the acute in adults, but otherwise uncertain?
In children, it must be quite rare if it occurs at all.
But
But it does occur in adult women.
Can the flu shot, DTaP, or Hep B cause transverse myelitis?
I would say that's unlikely. You said influenza, what would you say, hepatitis B?
Or DTaP?
Or DTaP. I think that's the most unlikely.
More likely that it would be the flu shot or Hep B?
Well, it's difficult with influenza because it's such a widely used vaccine, but I don't see any medical reason why any one of those vaccines should cause transverse myelitis.
But it has been reported.
It has been reported. Influenza, I suppose, maybe, but I'm not aware of any proof.
Are you aware that, okay. Can hepatitis B or the flu shot cause fibromyalgia?
Fibromyalgia, that's such a vague syndrome. It's, again, difficult to know, but, influenza is, there are some differences between influenza vaccine and other vaccines, but with hepatitis B, I don't see any reason why it should cause fibromyalgia.
So no on the hep B and maybe on the flu?
Yeah, I guess boils down to that.
Can the DTaP or Tdap cause acute disseminated encephalomyelitis?
I would say no.
Can the hepatitis A vaccine cause autoimmune hepatitis?
Oh dear, no.
Can hepatitis B cause lupus?
I see no reason why it could.
That's a no?
No.
Can influenza cause lupus? Influenza vaccine.
I can see no mechanistic reason why it would, and so I would say no.
Okay. Can the hepatitis B vaccine cause rheumatoid arthritis?
There have been studies along those lines, and I would say that they're unconvincing as far as the vaccine causing rheumatoid arthritis. The difficulty is that rheumatoid arthritis is a common disease, and it of course occurs frequently in adults, so it's very difficult to know whether some precipitating event could have caused it. But at this point, I would say no.
Vaccines are also commonly given to most people in the country, correct?
They're often given, yes.
So determining causality really requires a double-blind placebo-controlled study, correct?
It does if you want to be certain, or at least a statistically strong relationship.
What do you mean by statistically strong relationship?
I mean a situation where you have a comparative group and you can say that compared to the comparative group that the association you're looking at is statistically different than the control group.
And from that, you believe you can determine causation?
Well, you can determine association. Then you have to look and see whether there is some kind of biological explanation.
Well, isn't it difficult to determine association? Isn't it difficult to determine association when it comes to vaccines and a alleged injury, because everybody's, for the most part, gets vaccinated?
That is true. That is precisely why there are so many false associations between vaccines and disease.
Isn't it also the reason then that careful preclinical studies using an inert placebo should be conducted before licensure?
It would be ideal to do so, but one would also have to would have to be very large studies and covering different age groups, and by and large those data come out much later after experience with a vaccine used in thousands or millions of people.
Well, that of course presumes that the adverse events are long-term adverse events are rare, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know whether faith is susceptible to any? I'm going to try strike that. There's a lot of conditions, so I'm going to try this a little bit of a different way so we can get through this a bit quicker. Is faith susceptible to suffer any of the conditions we have reviewed thus far?
You mean the infectious diseases or the non-infectious diseases?
I'm talking about the adverse event. I'm talking about the conditions that we just reviewed, starting with thrombocytopenia and ending with rheumatoid arthritis.
I know nothing about the child, and therefore I'm unable to answer.
Do you know whether Faith has a genetic variant that renders her predisposed to suffer any of these conditions from vaccination?
I do not.
Do you know whether Faith has a genetic variant in her microbiome DNA that renders her predisposed to suffer any of the conditions we reviewed?
I am not aware of that.
Okay. Do you know whether Faith has any environmental exposure that would render her predisposed to suffer any of the conditions that we've just reviewed?
No.
Okay. In 1991, the IOM issued a report regarding vaccine safety. Are you familiar? Correct?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that report?
Yes.
That report looked at 22 serious injuries associated with DTaP vaccines and rubella vaccines, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Did you provide information to the... Was that a yes?
Yes.
Did you provide information to the IOM committee conducting this review?
I believe I sent them papers. I was not involved with the committee in any direct way.
Are you aware of whether they thanked you in the introduction?
They may have. I mean, I obviously was a source of information about rubella vaccine, for example.
The IOM searched for evidence regarding whether DPT can cause autism, correct?
Yes.
And they could not find any evidence that would help them to make any determination one way or another with regard to whether DPT causes autism, correct?
Well, if you mean that they use their statement of not having enough information to make a decision, probably yes.
Do you recall that they had 5 categories of conclusions, Dr. Plotkin, in that report?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. The first category, strike that. Do you recall that the first category was no evidence bearing on a causal relation?
I don't recall specifically, but I believe you're correct.
Okay, well I'll give you a copy. Let's get you a copy. Going to hand you, Dr. Plotkin, what's being marked as Exhibit 19. Yeah, you send it?
Uploading.
Okay. Dr. Plotkin, the title of this is The Adverse Effects of Pertussis and Rubella Vaccines, correct?
Yes.
This was by the Institute of Medicine in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we go to all the way. If you go to the second to last page, Dr. Plotkin, I suspect that's what you're looking for. All right. This is a table of the summary of conclusions by adverse event for DPT and MMR, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So there are 5 conclusion categories, correct? The first one is no evidence bearing on a causal relation, correct? And what that means, if you see the, was that a yes?
Yes.
Okay. If you go to footnote C, which defines what no evidence bearing on a causal relation means, isn't it true that it says, no category of evidence was found bearing on a judgment about causation. All categories of evidence left blank in table 1.1-1, correct?
Yes.
Okay. There's only one condition for which they couldn't find any evidence one way or another on whether whether the vaccine causes that condition, correct?
Right.
And that was, what was that condition?
Autism.
Okay. Now, the IOM reviewed whether DPT can cause 17 other serious conditions. And on this chart, it found that evidence supported a causation for 4 of them. For DPT, rejected causation for 4 of them, but that the evidence was insufficient to determine causation for 9 of them. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. As for the MMR vaccine, the IOM reviewed 4 conditions, right? For the first 2, was that a yes, Dr. Plotkin?
Yes.
I hate to trouble you, but if you could say yes instead of it would speed things along a bit. Appreciate it. If for 2 of them, it found that the evidence was insufficient to make a causation determination, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But for chronic arthritis, it found that the evidence is consistent with a causal relationship.
Yes.
That would be there's evidence consistent with a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and chronic arthritis, correct?
Yes.
And it also found that the evidence indicates a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and acute arthritis, correct?
Yes.
Do you dispute these findings?
Well, first of all, the IOM's later report was not as definitive as far as chronic arthritis is concerned. And the evidence for the consistency, first of all, it must be stressed, we're talking about adult women receiving the vaccine, not children. And the other point is that the data really came from one center in British Columbia and was not generally seen. As far as acute arthritis is concerned, it really should be arthralgia, not arthritis, because there's a difference between those 2 things. But anyway, there's no doubt that the vaccine does cause pains in the joints, but again, particularly in adult women, it is not a big problem in children.
On the next page, Dr. Plotkin, where it says of the report, it's under research needs. Does the first sentence say, in the course of its review, the committee encountered many gaps and limitations in knowledge bearing directly and indirectly on the safety of vaccines?
Yep.
Okay, and then the last sentence of that paragraph says, clearly if research capacity and accomplishment in these areas are not improved, future reviews of vaccine safety will be similarly handicapped, correct?
Right, correct.
Okay.
So I think it's worth pointing out that the vaccine community did respond to those conclusions, and that In particular, CDC set up a situation with centers like Kaiser Permanente in California, where they do very elaborate safety studies because they have a large populations receiving vaccines or not receiving vaccines, and they can do comparative studies. And in addition, WHO has set up safety